Devil May Cry is a game derived from a messy past. Originally planned to be Resident Evil 4 and directed by the bald-head Twitter sadist himself, Hideki Kamiya, it went through several iterations and rebrands until it was finally decided at Capcom that they should just let Kamiya do what he wants. And knowing what Kamiya ends up doing when he gets to do what he wants, it was sure to be quite the experience, for better or for worse. Thankfully, since Kamiya was coming right off the back end of directing Resident Evil 2, he wouldn't be doing anything too reckless. Except for maybe this. Poorly implemented shoot-'em-up sections aside, the game is a masterpiece, the origin of stylish action games, and a pioneer for 3D combat in general. But what a lot of people might not know is just how many weird, interesting, quirky mechanics there truly are in the original Devil May Cry. Speedrunners are known for being masters over their games, having poured hundreds or even thousands of hours into them. Most of the time, they know every single facet of them, the ins and the outs of every mechanic and every enemy. But with a game like Devil May Cry, sometimes knowledge is locked behind doors never open, behind language barriers, and behind paywalls. We once thought we knew all there was to know about Devil May Cry, but in the past few years, it's been shown that this is anything but the truth. Recently, there's been an explosion of exploration in Devil May Cry speedrunning. More and more people flooding into the community, filling the leaderboards with competent times, and even dethroning the long-standing world record holder Maxilobes 4 times in the past 6 months. With this explosion, more people have been venturing out into the unknown waters that are the all collectibles, 100%, and Dante must die categories. And these people have been uncovering more and more of the forgotten secrets that no one knew about since the game was developed over 20 years ago. Everything from how deactivating Devil Trigger works, to how the ranking system actually functions, and even how this boss takes damage. It's all been reevaluated and rediscovered to be completely different from how we initially thought. Or at least there was something that we were missing. So let's go down the iceberg and see what we have discovered in our 20 years of playing this masterpiece of a game. To this day, the most popular category is any percent normal. Popularized by Maxilobe's many games done quick runs, it quickly solidified itself as a fast and challenging category that's unforgiving due to its heavy use of the economics routing. The most optimal version of the run requires many S ranks and no damages on lots of the early game missions, so the player can use that money that they get to afford holy waters for mid and late game, and use them to annihilate the bosses. The route was very, very unforgiving. Missing even a single S rank by taking a single hit of damage in the early game could lock you out of over a minute or more of time save. This would kill any potential attempts at world record, or even a good time. In around 2019, however, many small discoveries were made that pushed the consistency levels higher as well as the speed. It was discovered that if you tap the shoot button in a specific rhythm with Ebony and Ivory, you can perform what we call quick shooting. This makes them shoot much faster than their intended fire rate. And since ironically, the guns in Devil May Cry 1 are the strongest in the whole series, yes, you heard me correctly, DMC2 haters, this obsoleted a lot of the use of close quarters combat in the early game missions, especially the basement on the first mission. This means faster clear times and more consistently no damaging the first mission, leading to more finished runs. That, alongside with other small discoveries like the fact that deactivating Devil Trigger manually loses about a whole stock, and you can avoid this by just leaving the room, and that doors store your angle when you travel through them into the next load zone, made DT management much more efficient, and allowed for more precise movement through rooms that would otherwise be extremely deadly. It couldn't be argued, Maxi was fast, the fastest by far, but what people would start to focus on primarily is alternate strategies that lowered the cost of entry into the fastest route without compromising time. If you couldn't beat him in execution, you could at least make it more consistent. The main way that this would be possible is by using less holy waters in the run, and because they're such a powerful tool, using less of them without losing time is a really hard standard to meet. If that was possible, then people would need to learn a lot about the bosses and their AI, so that's what they did. After coming through all the bosses in the game, we could only find one that could actually be made faster in any percent normal with less holy water uses. This one being Griffin 2. This strategy found by Dizzy Splits times a stinger into the boss at the precise time that it hits him through the wall after 2 grenade gun shots. Then the use of holy water kills him. This is exactly the same speed as using 2 holy waters, but it frees the player from having to spend an extra 700 orbs, making the early game just that much easier. Normally, when speedrunners are breaking apart their games, they do so by endlessly testing and theory crafting based on their own experiences, reverse engineering the game's systems and mechanics. And the same was true for Devil May Cry for a really long time. That is, until the discovery of a series of books. These books are essentially the holy grail of speedrunning, the thing that gamers everywhere wish existed, but ultimately was just thought too good to be true. An official mechanical breakdown of almost all of the game systems written by the developers for public consumption. This is essentially what the Kaitai Shinsho official Capcom guidebooks for the Devil May Cry games are. The only thing is, they were never actually officially translated into English, and since no one really knows that they exist in the first place, they took a really long time to get translated. 324 pages of untapped knowledge straight from the developers themselves, locked only behind the fact that it's all written in Japanese. Thankfully, with the help of some of the members in the community and translation tools, some of these pages have been translated into English, and the information has been extracted. But there are still many pages that go untranslated. So far, the most important information that we've gotten from such books, in Devil May Cry 1 at least, is clarifying stuff that we already knew. For instance, the marionettes have 3 different types: green, blue, and red. Each has progressively more health than the one prior, and it's totally random how much of each you get. But they also have random ranges of health inside of their own group, and the range is larger based on the HP of the enemy. So greens may have a range between 200 and 500 HP, and the reds might have a range between 1000 and 2000. The same is true for shadows. The amount of bullets it takes to make them show their core is random, for every shadow inside of a range. But if more of these pages are translated, especially the endless pages of graphs for enemy attack values and HP, it could lead to some really awesome and interesting discoveries, even if we may have reverse engineered most of them already. Also, enemies can get knocked out of bounds, lol. Some of the most potentially important pages in the book are the ones for the boss, Nightmare. This boss is an enigma. For most players, they'll never even start to understand the several layers of weird, obtuse mechanics that are laid on top of this fight, connected across 3 boss fights. These strats may be obtuse, but you're a cute. Remember to subscribe. In the any percent normal route, Maxi Lobes invented a strategy to hit the back core on Nightmare 5 times, then using a holy water to kill him in 1 cycle. This was extremely fast and super efficient. Most importantly, however, it also worked for all 3 fights. You see, Nightmare is an extremely complicated boss, and from what we have learned from the guide in recent events, and from our own experimentation, he works roughly like this. The boss has 2 forms, a goo form and a hard form. His goo form can only eat you up, bringing you inside of himself and making you fight some skulls, then one of 3 bosses. The boss always goes in this order: Phantom, Griffin, and then Nello Angelo. Breaking free from this by fighting and beating the second boss inflicts massive damage, but it also puts you back in the original boss arena. This can only be done once a fight, however, subsequent attempts to suck you in only deal damage. Once the dials on the outskirts of the room are hit, he will then go into his solid form. Here he has a multitude of attacks that are scripted depending on where you're standing, in front of him or behind him. After he does an attack, he lets out one of his 2 cores for you to damage. Front attacks unlock the front core, back attacks unlock the back one. These cores each have their own individual phases, 3 each: blue, green, then red. They start out blue, and the more times they're hit, the further into the colors they go. Each time a core is hit enough to go into a new phase, it gets more damage resistance, and the amount of time that you can attack the core is increased. But so too is the amount of time that the attack before the core release takes. The interesting thing is these core phases actually transcend across all 3 boss fights. So if you break a core into green in the first fight on mission 16, it will start green on the fight in mission 18. And if you break that core again to red on 18, it'll start as red on mission 20. This mechanic is not explained whatsoever, and is the primary reason many first-time players have an extremely hard time on this boss. The real kicker, however, is the cores change phases not actually determined by the amount of damage that they take, but by the amount of specific value that each attack is assigned. Once the value of the cumulative attacks reaches a certain value, the core changes phases. But the values are not assigned based on damage, but on impact. Attacks that hit many times for small damage break the core faster, and don't do as much damage. Slower, heavy attacks break it slower, while also doing more damage. So if you do tons of small sword swings, you'll break the cores really fast, while doing very little damage. But if you fully charge Ifrit attacks, you can do a ton of damage without changing the core's phases very fast. With Maxi's strategy, you end up doing just under enough stun value to keep the core from ever going red across all 3 fights, while maintaining the use of a holy water and a 1 cycle. This strategy was one of the coolest in the game, and required a very in-depth amount of knowledge on how Nightmare functioned, but ultimately it was only useful for that difficulty. And because of the explosion in players, many were looking towards categories not to be as heavy on item use, and to rely more on combat efficiency, and less of an economic impact. Some started speedrunning the 100% category, that requires the players to collect all items and collectibles, as well as S-rank every mission. Because you get penalized for using items, it's hard to S-rank a lot of the missions if you use a holy water, so some bosses had to go without. However, Nightmare was an exception. No one knew how to beat that boss fast without using holy waters, since in 100% you're required to do the secret missions often. The bonuses to your rank for completing those secret missions outweighs the holy water uses, allowing for them to be able to use a holy water and still get an S rank. This would not be the case in Dante Must Die difficulty runs, however. Those who ventured into DMD would be greeted with new enemy arrangements, a slightly easier ranking system, way more expensive items, and much harder bosses. The DMD categories were basically untouched at a time where no one bothered to run them because they were so difficult. That is, except for a few Japanese speedrunners. Japanese speedrunners often have a reputation in the speedrunning community for being insanely good, but also holding very different values to Western runners. They often end up running and grinding individual level runs, or more niche categories, grinding them into the dust single-handedly with no competition. And because of the language barrier, they rarely act as a part of the community, opting to just do runs by themselves, not communicating or sharing much information. This is totally understandable, but there's also an overlap between a lot of that and a tendency for them to have to do runs with no microphone, no camera, no input display, or sometimes even a timer. This makes it very hard to verify if the run was actually done in a single segment, especially since the level of play is usually a step above most other runners. And this is especially true in Devil May Cry. In the early days of the game, it was timed using the game's in-game timer, so that all platforms could compete with each other on an even playing field. This was fine for the moment, but it was discovered that there are many places where the in-game timer simply isn't running at all, like on the mission start screen or during intermissions between levels. It was in the Western philosophy that you shouldn't abuse these times and just run with a real-time timer. But plenty of Eastern players would do things like take breaks during the menus and grind for money during intermissions. Due to this, lots of the current Western player base never actually watched many of the 100% and Dante Must Die world records that they were running against. Why would they, after all? Since those runs are so old, right? Well, as it turns out, no, they were in fact not right. While routing the newest popular category, Dante Must Die 100%, myself and Slickford ran into a problem. We couldn't fight Nightmare without breaking his cores. On DMD, he had way more HP, so you couldn't use the Holy Water strategy. And on DMD, Holy Waters are way more expensive anyways, so it was simply just not an option. Our only choice was, with the knowledge that we had, to temper out fully charged Ifrit hits on both cores, trying not to break them across the fights. This was inconsistent at best, and most of the time we would just intentionally get eaten for the free damage, even if we knew theoretically it wasn't faster. We did discover a new thing though. Turns out the core phase value gets reset to the beginning of the fight when you get eaten. So by getting eaten, you could guarantee no core breaks for all 3 fights, making the fight much more consistent. The only problem was, getting eaten is pretty slow. Like, really slow. It loses nearly a minute over not getting eaten on every single fight. It was like it was perfectly set up just to mess with us. If you only hit with fully charged Ifrit attacks, the cores would break on the 14th hit. You could hit each core 13 times and have neither break, but this would leave Nightmare with just enough HP to need 2 more hits. The boss was designed in a way that on DMD, it was unavoidable to break at least 1 core per fight, at least with this strategy. You can break the top core in the first fight and the back core in the second one, starting the third Nightmare with both cores being green. But this was not optimal for doing so, as it led you into a really awkward cycle on both fights, making it not much faster than just getting eaten. And on the third fight, you would always need to be eaten anyways. This seemed like an unavoidable fate until one day someone came into the Discord and shared these videos. As it turns out, there is a gradual increase in the amount of damage that Ifrit attacks inflict depending on how long it's been charged. It takes 72 frames to fully charge, but on the 61st frame, it actually does substantially more damage than it does on frame 62 to 72. So by timing your attack perfectly, you can actually increase the amount of damage by nearly double. As it turns out, this attack stacks with Devil Trigger, so nearly 4 times the damage than when fully charged without DT. It was also discovered that if you have the weapon Nightmare Beta equipped, your left-handed Ifrit attacks, the hand with Nightmare Beta attached, does an additional 2 times damage multiplier. These damage multipliers cancel each other out, but they can be stacked if you press Devil Trigger on the same frame that you hit, making it nearly 8 times damage per hit. This is super strong, but unfortunately, Nightmare already has around 8 time damage multiplier for fully charged Ifrit attacks, and it seems that the multiplier cancels out the Nightmare Beta and DT stacking effect. So we were left with the same problem. That is until I finally decided, hey, since I made this new strategy, how much faster is it than the old Japanese runner strats? And I booted up DeSote's any % Dante Must Die world record from over 2 years ago to see this. It was almost 40 seconds faster than my strategy, and my strategy was nearly a minute faster than what we were currently using. As it turns out, the Japanese runners knew about this stuff years before we did. They knew about how to manipulate the cores and what attacks do the most damage. They also knew stuff we didn't know, like apparently guns do little to no damage in progressing breaking the cores, including the grenade gun. So you can get tons of free damage. That and that Helm Breaker nearly instantly breaks the top core all by itself. Simply because the old runs were slow and we thought that we knew better, no one had actually took the time to watch the runs that had already been done. Because of this, we missed out on some information and these strategies for years. Checking even older runs, variations of this strategy existed as far as 7 years ago. Hell, maybe even earlier than that. The basic breakdown goes like this. By doing a double jump Helm Breaker right at the start of the fight on the top core, you could spam Stinger and Grenade Gun for massive damage, breaking the core into its second phase, the green phase. This is important because the green core makes the top core stay out for significantly longer, allowing for massive damage. Then, switching to Ifrit, you alternate back and forth between the front and the back, pairing the attacks with Rolling Blaze, an ability for Ifrit. When you defeat Nightmare, the core health resets for the next fight, so even though the green core was only like 1 hit away from going red, it's back to full green for the next fight, giving us plenty of room to work with on mission 18. In this fight, you break the back core to green by repeatedly baiting an attack, then finishing him off with Ifrit. Then on mission 20, it doesn't matter if you break the top core because it's scripted to break at the end of the fight, and then you can use a holy water to finish him off. Discoveries like this are why it's so interesting to take a look at other categories and old speedruns. Even with over a 20-year-old game, there is an absolute treasure trove of new understanding to be yearned from old runs, forum posts, official guidebooks, and personal testing. And hell, who knows? Even though most of these discoveries are only useful right now for Dante Must Die and 100% categories, maybe some of these discoveries will come back and makes for some time save in any % normal someday too. So what do you think of the iceberg that is Devil May Cry speedrunning? Let me know if there's anything you're more curious about, and look out for a potential video about that 100% Dante Must Die category. Thanks so much for watching. These beautiful patrons support me. You should too. Much love, you guys. Peace.
Machine Girl.